So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. You've probably looked into the eyes of a dog at some point. Maybe your own dog, maybe a friend's. And you've had this strange, fleeting moment where you thought, there's somebody in there. Not just a biological machine responding to stimuli, not just a bundle of reflexes and conditioned behaviors, but an actual someone, a being that experiences the world, that feels something. And then maybe you dismissed it, or maybe you didn't. But either way, that moment, that flicker of recognition, is one of the oldest and most genuinely confusing questions human beings have ever tried to answer. What is it like to be another animal? Is it like anything at all? And how could we possibly know? That's what we're going to wander through tonight, slowly, from a lot of different angles. No rush. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that's perfectly fine. The ideas will be here, turning gently, and you can pick them up wherever you find them. Let's start way back. And I mean way back. Because the question of whether animals have inner lives, whether they experience the world consciously the way you and I seem to, this isn't a modern question. It's not something that popped up in a neuroscience lab in the 1990s. People have been wrestling with this for thousands of years, and the answers they've come up with have shaped everything from how we farm, to how we do science, to how we write our laws. The ancient Greeks were already arguing about it. Aristotle, around 350 BCE, had this whole framework he called the Scala Naturae, the great chain of being. And in his view, life was arranged on a kind of ladder. Plants were at the bottom. They had what he called a nutritive soul. They could grow and reproduce, but that was about it. Animals were a step up. They had a sensitive soul, meaning they could perceive the world. They could feel pleasure and pain. They could move around with purpose. And humans were at the top because we had a rational soul. We could reason, we could deliberate, we could think about thinking. Now, here's what's interesting about Aristotle's view. He absolutely believed animals had experiences. He thought they could feel fear, desire, anger. He watched animals closely. He was a remarkable naturalist, actually, one of the best observers of animal behavior in the ancient world. And he took it as obvious that a frightened deer was genuinely afraid, that a loyal dog genuinely recognized its owner. What animals lacked, in his framework, wasn't feeling, it was reason. They couldn't reflect on their own experiences. They couldn't form beliefs about the future in the way humans could. But the lights were on, so to speak. There was something it was like to be a dog or a horse or an octopus. He just thought that something was simpler, less layered than what humans experience. And that view, animals feel, but they don't reason, was more or less the common sense position across a lot of cultures for a very long time. The Stoics pushed back a bit, arguing that animals were more mechanical than Aristotle allowed. But even they generally accepted that animals had some form of perception and impulse. In Indian philosophy, traditions like Jainism and Buddhism took it even further. The idea that animals have rich inner lives was foundational. Jain monks would sweep the path in front of them to avoid stepping on insects, because every living being was understood to have a soul capable of suffering. The Buddhist concept of sentient beings, beings who feel, explicitly included animals, and the whole ethical framework of karma depended on it. So for most of human history, across most cultures, the default assumption was, yes, animals are conscious in some meaningful way. They feel things. They experience the world. The details were debated endlessly, but the basic premise was widely shared. And then something happened in Europe in the 1600s that changed the conversation dramatically. And this is where things get really strange, because the person who changed it was one of the most brilliant minds who ever lived, and his conclusion was, by modern standards, almost certainly wrong. But the ripple effects of his thinking shaped science and philosophy for centuries. René Descartes. You've heard the name. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician, born in 1596, and he was obsessed with certainty. He wanted to strip away everything he couldn't be absolutely sure of and rebuild knowledge from the ground up. And the one thing he couldn't doubt was his own consciousness. The fact that he was thinking right now proved that he existed as a thinking thing. But here's the thing about Descartes that people often get wrong. He wasn't just a philosopher sitting in an armchair. He was deeply interested in physiology. He dissected animals. He studied the mechanics of the body in remarkable detail for his era. And what he concluded was that the body, any body, human or animal, was essentially a machine. A very complex machine made of flesh and fluid instead of gears and springs, but a machine nonetheless. The heart was a pump. The nerves were like tubes carrying animal spirits, which was the term they used for what we'd now call nerve impulses. The muscles contracted and extended through purely mechanical processes. For humans, Descartes believed there was something extra, a soul, a thinking substance that interacted with the body through the pineal gland, this tiny structure deep in the brain. The soul was where consciousness lived. It was where you experienced the redness of red, the pain of a burn, the sweetness of a thought. And the soul was uniquely human. It was given by God. Animals didn't have one. And this led Descartes to a conclusion that sounds shocking to modern ears. He argued that animals were essentially automata, biological robots. When a dog yelped after being kicked, Descartes suggested that the yelp was like the sound a machine makes when you press a lever. There was no inner experience behind it, no pain in the way you and I understand pain. The dog's body was responding mechanically to a stimulus, but nobody was home. There was no felt quality to the experience because there was no soul to do the feeling. Now, I want to be careful here because there's actually some scholarly debate about exactly how far Descartes took this. Some historians argue that his position was more nuanced than the caricature, that he may have allowed for some basic form of sensation in animals while denying them reflective thought. His actual writings are a bit ambiguous in places, but the version that took hold, the version that influenced generations of scientists and philosophers, was the strong version. Animals are machines, and machines don't feel. And here's what's really unsettling about this. It wasn't just a philosophical position. It had real, practical consequences. In the decades after Descartes, there are accounts, and these are documented, though the details are sometimes disputed, of researchers at the Port Royal School in France performing vivisection on fully conscious animals, cutting into living dogs without anesthesia, and dismissing their cries as mere mechanical responses. The Cartesian framework gave them intellectual permission to do this. If the animal isn't feeling anything, then there's no moral problem. It's like taking apart a clock. Think about what that means. A philosophical argument about the nature of consciousness directly shaped how living creatures were treated. Ideas have consequences, and in this case, the consequences were brutal. But not everyone bought it. Even in Descartes' own time, there were critics. Voltaire, writing about a century later, put it beautifully. He said something along the lines of, "They've nailed a dog to a table and cut it open alive, and you tell me this creature, which has the same organs of sensation as you, doesn't feel?" That's an absurd position, and many ordinary people, farmers, pet owners, anyone who spent time around animals, found the Cartesian view ridiculous on its face. They could see that their animals experienced things. The philosophical argument just didn't match the observable reality. But here's why the Cartesian view mattered so much, and why we're spending time on it tonight. It wasn't just about animals. It was about a deeper question, maybe the deepest question in all of philosophy, called the problem of other minds. And this is worth understanding, because it's the reason animal consciousness is so genuinely, legitimately confusing, even today. Here's the problem, stated simply. You know that you are conscious. You know this directly, immediately, without any doubt. You experience things. You feel the warmth of a blanket, the taste of coffee, the ache of sadness. These experiences are real to you. But how do you know that anyone else is conscious? How do you know that the person sitting across from you at dinner isn't a perfect zombie? Something that behaves exactly like a conscious being, says all the right things, makes all the right facial expressions, but has no inner experience whatsoever. No lights on inside. The honest answer is, you can't know for certain. You infer it. You reason by analogy. That person has a brain like mine, a body like mine. They behave the way I behave when I'm feeling things. So they're probably feeling things too. And that inference is so automatic, so deeply wired into us, that it doesn't even feel like an inference. It feels like direct knowledge. But it's not. It's a guess. A very good guess, almost certainly correct, but still a guess. Now extend that problem to animals. A chimpanzee has a brain that's quite similar to yours. Same basic architecture, same neurotransmitters, many of the same structures. When a chimp shows what looks like grief over a dead infant, carrying the body for days, refusing to eat, is that grief? It looks like grief. It maps onto grief, but you can't get inside the chimp's head and check. You're still making an inference. And the further you move from humans on the evolutionary tree, the harder that inference becomes. A dog? Probably conscious, most people would say. A fish? Less certain. A bee? An earthworm? A bacterium? Where do you draw the line? And more importantly, on what basis do you draw it? What's the criterion? Brain size? Behavioral complexity? The presence of certain neural structures? Every criterion anyone has ever proposed has problems, and we'll get into those problems as the night goes on. This is what makes animal consciousness such a beautifully tangled question. It sits right at the intersection of philosophy, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and ethics. And for a long time, really, from Descartes all the way through the early 20th century, mainstream Western science mostly avoided the question. Not because scientists didn't care, but because the question seemed scientifically unanswerable. You can't measure consciousness with a thermometer. You can't weigh it on a scale. And in the behaviorist era, which dominated psychology for much of the 1900s, even talking about the inner mental lives of humans was considered unscientific, let alone the inner lives of animals. The behaviorists, people like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, argued that science should concern itself only with observable behavior. Stimulus and response, input and output. What happens inside the black box of the mind was, by definition, outside the reach of scientific investigation. Watson, writing in 1913, was explicit about this. He said psychology should be a purely objective experimental branch of natural science, with no role for introspection or consciousness, and if you couldn't even talk about human consciousness scientifically, then animal consciousness was completely off the table. Skinner, who dominated American psychology from the 1930s through the 1960s, took this even further. He could train pigeons to play ping pong, rats to run elaborate mazes, and he explained all of it through reinforcement and conditioning. No need to invoke feelings, desires, or awareness. The animal learns that pressing a lever produces food. It presses the lever more. That's it. That's the whole story. Anything beyond that, any talk of what the rat wants or how the pigeon feels, was unscientific speculation. And there's something seductive about that position, honestly. It's clean. It's rigorous. It keeps you from projecting your own emotions onto creatures that might experience the world in completely alien ways. The danger of anthropomorphism, of assuming animals think and feel just like humans, is real, and the behaviorists were right to worry about it. But they overcorrected, massively. Because in their determination to avoid one error, assuming too much about animal minds, they fell into the opposite error, assuming too little. And the cracks in the behaviorist framework started showing up in some fascinating and unexpected places. One of the most important came from a field you might not expect: ethology, the study of animal behavior in natural settings. And the person who did more than almost anyone to crack open the question of animal minds was a young woman who went to Tanzania in 1960 with a notebook, a pair of binoculars, and no formal scientific training. Her name was Jane Goodall, and what she found in the forests of Gombe Stream changed everything. Because Goodall didn't just observe chimpanzees from a distance and record their movements like dots on a chart. She got close, remarkably close. She sat among them, day after day, week after week, until they accepted her presence as something between curiosity and furniture. And what she saw in those early months at Gombe shattered assumptions that had been comfortably in place for centuries. The first major bombshell was tool use. In October 1960, Goodall watched a chimpanzee she'd named David Greybeard, and that name itself was controversial, by the way, because proper scientists didn't name their subjects, they numbered them. She watched David Greybeard strip the leaves off a twig, carefully shape it, and then insert it into a termite mound to fish out termites. He was making a tool, not just picking up a convenient stick, but modifying an object for a specific purpose. When Goodall reported this to her mentor, the legendary paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey, his response became one of the most quoted lines in the history of science. He said, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans." Because up until that moment, the ability to make and use tools was considered the bright dividing line between humans and everything else. It was our thing, our special claim, and a young woman with no PhD had just erased it with a single observation in a Tanzanian forest. But here's the thing: tool use, as dramatic as it was, wasn't really the most radical part of what Goodall brought back from Gombe. The deeper revolution was in how she described what she saw. She talked about chimpanzee personalities. She described their emotional lives: grief when a mother died, joy during play, what looked unmistakably like jealousy and consolation, and political scheming. She described Flo, the matriarch, and the complex web of relationships in her family. She described Passion, a chimpanzee who was, by any reasonable reading, a genuinely disturbing individual, cold, calculating, and eventually infanticidal. These weren't interchangeable stimulus response machines. They were individuals, with histories and temperaments and what certainly looked like inner lives, and the scientific establishment pushed back hard. When Goodall arrived at Cambridge to work on her PhD, Leakey had arranged for her to study there, despite lacking an undergraduate degree, which was almost unheard of. Her professors told her she was doing it all wrong. You can't name your subjects. You can't attribute emotions to them. You can't say a chimpanzee is happy or sad or angry. That's anthropomorphism. That's projection. That's not science. She later recalled being told that she should have referred to the chimpanzees as it, not he or she. And Goodall, to her enormous credit, essentially said no. She'd had a teacher as a child, she said, who taught her that animals do have personalities, minds, and feelings. That teacher was her dog, Rusty, and she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen just because it made certain academics uncomfortable. Now, was the scientific establishment entirely wrong to be cautious? No. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because the tension between Goodall's approach and the behaviorist critique is actually one of the most important tensions in the entire study of animal consciousness, and it hasn't been fully resolved even today. The behaviorists had a legitimate point. When you watch a dog wag its tail and say, "The dog is happy," you're making an inference. You're taking an external behavior and mapping your own internal experience onto it. And you might be right. The dog might indeed be experiencing something analogous to human happiness. But you might also be wrong. The dog might be experiencing something completely different that just happens to look like happiness to you. Or the tail wagging might be a purely mechanical response with no experiential component at all. You genuinely can't tell from the outside. This is the problem of other minds again. The same puzzle we touched on earlier. But now it's wearing a lab coat. And it cuts deep. Because think about what we're really asking when we ask whether an animal is conscious. We're asking whether there is something it is like to be that animal, whether the lights are on inside, whether the chimp watching the sunset over Lake Tanganyika is having an experience of that sunset, colors, feelings, some kind of inner registration, or whether it's all just processing, all just inputs and outputs with nobody home. And that phrase, "something it is like," comes from a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, who in 1974 wrote what might be the single most influential paper in the philosophy of consciousness. It was called, "What is it like to be a bat?" And it's one of those rare academic papers that's actually a pleasure to read. Nagel's argument was elegant and honestly, a little devastating. He said, look, we know bats perceive the world primarily through echolocation. They emit ultrasonic clicks and build a picture of their environment from the returning echoes. We can study the physics of this. We can map the neural pathways involved. We can describe the entire mechanism in exquisite detail. But none of that tells us what it feels like from the inside to perceive the world through sonar. We can try to imagine it, try to picture what it would be like for us to navigate by sound. But that's just imagining what it would be like for a human to have bat-like abilities. It's not imagining what it's like for the bat. The bat's subjective experience, if it has one, might be so alien to ours that we literally cannot conceive of it. And here's the kicker. Nagel wasn't arguing that bats aren't conscious. He actually assumed they probably are. His point was that consciousness has an irreducibly subjective character that objective science struggles to capture. You can know every physical fact about a bat's brain and still not know what it's like to be one. This became known as the hard problem of consciousness, a term actually coined later, in 1995, by the philosopher David Chalmers. But the core idea was right there in Nagel's bat paper. The easy problems of consciousness, Chalmers said, are things like explaining how the brain processes sensory information, how it integrates data, how it controls behavior. Those are hard in practice, but straightforward in principle. They're engineering problems, essentially. The hard problem is explaining why any of that processing is accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why does it feel like something to see red? Why isn't all that neural computation just happening in the dark with no inner witness? Now, I realize we've drifted from the forests of Gombe into some fairly deep philosophical waters, but this matters for understanding why the question of animal consciousness is so genuinely difficult. It's not just that we can't ask animals how they feel. It's that even if we could, even if a parrot could tell us, "I feel pain," we'd still face the question of whether those words reflect genuine inner experience or are just a sophisticated, learned response. The problem goes all the way down. But here's what's really interesting. While the philosophers were wrestling with these seemingly intractable puzzles, the scientists were quietly accumulating evidence that made it harder and harder to deny that something was going on inside animal minds. And the evidence came from multiple directions at once. Let's talk about one of the most compelling lines of evidence: mirror self-recognition. In 1970, a psychologist named Gordon Gallup Jr. did something clever. He put mirrors in the cages of chimpanzees. At first, the chimps reacted the way you'd expect. They treated the reflection as another chimp. They displayed at it, threatened it, tried to look behind the mirror. But after a few days, something shifted. They started using the mirror to examine parts of their own bodies they couldn't normally see. They'd look at their teeth, inspect the inside of their mouths, make faces. They were recognizing themselves. But Gallup wanted to be sure, so he designed what became known as the mark test. While the chimps were anesthetized, he painted an odorless, non-irritating red dye on their foreheads and ears, places they couldn't see without a mirror. When they woke up and saw their reflections, they immediately reached up and touched the marks on their own faces. Not the mirror, their own faces. They understood that the image in the mirror was them. Think about what that means for a second. To recognize yourself in a mirror, you need some kind of mental model of what you look like. You need a concept of self. You need to understand that the entity in the mirror and the entity doing the looking are the same being. That's not a simple stimulus response. That's not lever pressing for food pellets. That's something else entirely. And the fascinating thing is that not all animals pass the mirror test. Chimpanzees do. Orangutans do. Bonobos do. Gorillas, interestingly, mostly don't, though there are individual exceptions. And some researchers think gorillas fail because they find direct eye contact threatening, not because they lack self-awareness. But dogs don't pass it. Cats don't. Monkeys generally don't. And for a while, the mirror test seemed to draw a neat line between the great apes and everyone else, suggesting that self-awareness was a rare cognitive achievement limited to our closest relatives. And then things got complicated, because in 2006, a team led by Diana Rice and Lori Marino showed that bottlenose dolphins passed the mirror test. They marked dolphins with temporary ink and watched them swim immediately to the mirror to inspect the marks, twisting their bodies to get a better view. Dolphins. Animals whose last common ancestor with primates lived something like 95 million years ago. Whatever cognitive machinery underlies self-recognition, dolphins and apes evolved it independently. And then elephants passed the test too. A 2006 study by Joshua Plotnick and Franz de Waal showed an Asian elephant named Happy repeatedly touching a mark on her head while looking in a mirror. And then Perhaps most surprisingly of all, in 2008, magpies passed the mark test. Birds, animals with brains organized completely differently from mammals, with no neocortex at all. Magpies are corvids, the family that includes crows, ravens, and jays, and they've been turning up in consciousness research with almost alarming regularity, because corvids do things that, frankly, are hard to explain without invoking something like thinking. New Caledonian crows make tools, not just using sticks, but crafting them, bending wire into hooks, combining multiple components into a single tool. They plan for the future. They appear to understand what other crows can and cannot see, and they adjust their food-hiding behavior accordingly, which implies they're modeling another individual's mental state. That's called theory of mind, and it used to be considered uniquely human. So by the early 2000s, you had this mounting pile of evidence from ethology, comparative psychology, and cognitive science that was making the old behaviorist position increasingly untenable. Animals weren't just stimulus response machines. Some of them recognized themselves. Some of them made tools. Some of them seemed to understand what others were thinking. Some of them appeared to grieve, to play, to deceive, to plan. And the question that kept pressing harder and harder was, if they're doing all of these things that, in humans, we associate with conscious experience, then isn't the simplest explanation that they, too, are having conscious experiences? But simple explanations aren't always correct, and this is where a man named Daniel Dennett enters the picture with a perspective that made a lot of people uncomfortable, including, honestly, a lot of people who study animal behavior. Dennett, a philosopher at Tufts University, has been one of the most provocative voices in consciousness studies since the 1990s, and his basic argument is that we're confused about what consciousness even is. We think of it as this special inner light, this theater of the mind where experiences are projected for some internal audience. But Dennett says that picture is wrong. There is no theater. There is no audience. There's just a brain doing a lot of parallel processing, and what we call consciousness is really just the brain's way of talking about its own states. It's not an extra thing on top of the processing. It is the processing, described from a particular angle. And if Dennett is right, and this is deeply contested to be clear, then the question of animal consciousness shifts in an interesting way. Because you're no longer asking whether the lights are on inside. You're asking what kinds of self-modeling, what kinds of internal representation, what kinds of information integration a particular animal brain is capable of. And that's a question science can actually get traction on. It's measurable, it's testable, it moves the whole discussion from philosophy into neuroscience. Which brings us to what was happening inside the labs, because while the ethologists were watching animals in the wild, and the philosophers were arguing about the hard problem, the neuroscientists were starting to crack open animal brains. Not literally, not always, but with increasingly sophisticated tools. And what they were finding in there was remarkable. Genuinely remarkable. Because the assumption for a very long time had been that animal brains were simpler versions of human brains, scaled down, stripped back, running on fewer cylinders. And in some gross anatomical sense, that's true. A mouse brain weighs about half a gram. A human brain weighs about 1,400 grams. That's a massive difference. But what the neuroscientists were discovering, especially from the 1990s onward, is that size isn't really the point. Structure matters, connectivity matters, and some of the neural architectures that we associate with conscious experience in humans were showing up in places nobody expected. Let's talk about the cortex for a second, because this is where a lot of the confusion and a lot of the breakthroughs live. In mammals, the cerebral cortex is this wrinkled outer layer of the brain, and it's where a huge amount of our higher-order processing happens. Perception, decision-making, planning, the integration of sensory information into a coherent picture of the world. All of that is heavily cortex-dependent in humans. And for decades, the working assumption was pretty straightforward. If you want consciousness, you need a cortex, preferably a big one, preferably a wrinkly one, because the wrinkles, the folds, technically called sulci and gyri, increase the surface area, which means more neurons packed into the same volume. Humans have a deeply folded cortex. Dolphins, actually, have an even more folded one in some respects. Dogs have a moderately folded cortex. Rats have a smoother one. And birds? Birds don't have a cortex at all, not in the mammalian sense. And that fact, that birds lack a layered cerebral cortex, was used for years to dismiss any suggestion that birds might have rich inner lives. The reasoning seemed airtight. Consciousness requires cortical processing. Birds don't have a cortex. Therefore, birds aren't conscious, or at least they're conscious in only the most rudimentary, flickering way. Background noise, not a symphony. But here's what was actually happening in the labs. Researchers studying bird brains, particularly in the early 2000s, started mapping the avian forebrain in much more detail than had been done before, and they found something that forced a major rethink. The bird forebrain, the part called the pallium, doesn't have the six-layered structure of the mammalian cortex. It's organized differently, in clusters rather than layers. But functionally, it was doing remarkably similar things. The neurons were connecting in ways that supported complex information processing, flexible decision-making, working memory. A group of researchers, led by a consortium that included people like Eric Jarvis at Duke University, published a major paper in 2005 proposing a complete renaming of bird brain structures, because the old names, which implied that bird forebrains were primitive, dominated by instinct-driven basal ganglia, were just wrong. The old terminology was based on a 19th century assumption that had calcified into textbook fact without anyone going back to check it properly. Think about what that means. For over a century, scientists had been looking at bird brains through a lens that was fundamentally miscalibrated. They were seeing simple where there was complex, seeing reflex where there was cognition. And once you corrected the map, once you actually looked at what these neural circuits were doing rather than just what they looked like under a microscope, the picture changed dramatically. And this is where the corvids come roaring back into the story. Remember the New Caledonian crows making tools, the scrub jays caching food and apparently thinking about the future? Well, when you look at the brains of corvids, something jumps out. Relative to their body size, corvids have enormous forebrains. The neuron density in a crow's pallium is extraordinary, actually higher, in terms of neurons per unit volume, than in many primate cortices. A study published in 2016 by Severin Olkowicz and colleagues counted the neurons in the brains of various bird species and found that parrots and corvids pack neurons into their forebrains at densities that rival or exceed those found in primate brains. A macaw, which has a brain the size of a shelled walnut, has roughly the same number of forebrain neurons as a macaque monkey, whose brain is considerably larger. The neurons are just smaller and packed more tightly. So the old equation, big brain equals smart, small brain equals dumb, was wrong. It was always wrong, but now there were numbers to prove it. What matters isn't the total mass of brain tissue. What matters is the number of neurons, how they're connected, and what kind of processing they can support. And by that measure, a crow's brain is a far more impressive instrument than its size would suggest. Now, this raises a fascinating question about the evolution of consciousness. And it's worth slowing down here, because this is one of those ideas that, once you really sit with it, changes how you think about the natural world. If birds, which split off from the mammalian lineage something like 320 million years ago, back when our common ancestor was a small, lizard-like creature scurrying around in the Carboniferous, if birds independently evolved the neural hardware for complex cognition, for flexible problem-solving, for what looks an awful lot like conscious experience, then consciousness isn't some unique trick that evolution stumbled upon once and handed down through the mammalian line. It's something that evolution has invented multiple times through different architectures, using different building materials, but arriving at similar functional outcomes. Biologists call this convergent evolution, and it's the same principle that gave both birds and bats wings, even though they evolved flight independently. Eyes evolved independently dozens of times across the animal kingdom, and consciousness, or at least the neural substrates that support it, may have done the same. And if that's true, then the question of which animals are conscious gets a lot harder to answer by just looking at brain anatomy, because you can't say, well, this animal doesn't have a cortex, so it can't be conscious. You have to ask instead, does this animal's brain, whatever its structure, support the kind of information integration, the kind of self-modeling, the kind of flexible, context-sensitive processing that we associate with conscious experience? And that's a much more open-ended question, which brings us to one of the most important documents in the modern history of animal consciousness research, and it happened in a place you might not expect. Cambridge, England. July 7th, 2012. A group of prominent neuroscientists gathered at a conference, and at the end of the evening, apparently after a fair amount of wine, which feels appropriate for a declaration about the nature of mind, they signed what's known as the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. The declaration was edited by Philip Lowe and signed in the presence of Stephen Hawking, and its key statement is worth hearing almost verbatim. It said that the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, possess these neurological substrates. Now, let's unpack that for a second, because it's doing a lot of work. First, notice what it's saying and what it's not saying. It's not saying animals are conscious. That would be a philosophical claim, and these were neuroscientists being careful. It's saying animals possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. The hardware is there. The wiring is there. The functional architecture is there. And the implication is clear. If the hardware for consciousness is present, and if that hardware is doing the same kinds of things it does in human brains where we know consciousness exists, then the simplest explanation is that these animals are having conscious experiences too. And notice the list. All mammals, all birds, and then, almost as a bombshell tucked into the end of the sentence, octopuses. Octopuses. An animal that is so evolutionarily distant from us that our last common ancestor was probably a simple worm-like creature living in the ocean over 500 million years ago. An animal whose nervous system is organized in a completely alien way. About 2/3 of an octopus's neurons are in its arms, not in its central brain. Each arm can taste, touch, and to some degree make decisions semi-independently. The octopus brain doesn't even have a clear centralized structure the way vertebrate brains do. And yet the neuroscientists at Cambridge looked at the evidence and said, yes, include them. Why? What was the evidence that pushed octopuses onto that list? Well, by 2012, there was already a substantial body of research showing that octopuses are capable of things that are very hard to explain without invoking some form of inner experience. They solve complex puzzles. They learn by observation, watching another octopus open a jar and then doing it themselves. They play, which is a behavior that's really hard to explain in purely mechanistic terms, because play has no immediate survival benefit. Jennifer Mather, a psychologist at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, has documented octopuses in aquariums repeatedly blowing water jets at floating bottles to push them around, apparently for fun. They recognize individual human faces and behave differently toward different people, being friendly toward keepers who feed them and squirting water at people who have annoyed them. There's a famous case at the University of Otago in New Zealand where an octopus repeatedly short-circuited a light above its tank by squirting water at it, apparently because the light was bothering it. And here's the thing that really gets you. The thing that makes octopus consciousness so philosophically dizzying. Their nervous system is so different from ours that if they are conscious, their consciousness must be profoundly unlike human consciousness. We can barely imagine what it's like to be a bat, as Nagel pointed out. What is it like to be an octopus, with most of your neurons distributed across 8 semi-autonomous arms, with skin that can change color and texture in milliseconds, with eyes that see polarized light, with a body that has no skeleton and can squeeze through any opening larger than its beak? If there's something it's like to be an octopus, and the Cambridge Declaration suggests there probably is, then the space of possible conscious experiences is vastly larger and stranger than we ever imagined. But the Cambridge Declaration, for all its significance, also highlighted a problem that the field still hasn't fully solved. And it's a problem that takes us right back to the engineering challenge at the heart of all this. How do you actually test for consciousness? How do you build a reliable detector for something that, by its very nature, is subjective and internal? Because signing a declaration is one thing. Designing an experiment that can distinguish between genuine conscious experience and sophisticated unconscious processing, that's something else entirely. And by the 2000s, a handful of researchers were starting to propose frameworks that might, just might, give us a way to do exactly that. One of the most ambitious of these frameworks came from a neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi, and his theory has one of those names that sounds intimidating at first, but turns out to be built on a beautifully simple idea. He called it integrated information theory, and the core insight goes something like this. Consciousness isn't about what a system is made of. It's not about whether you have neurons or silicon chips or something else entirely. Consciousness is about how information is integrated within a system. That's the key word, integrated. And to understand what Tononi means by that, think about it this way. Imagine you're looking at a photograph, a simple one, let's say a red apple sitting on a wooden table. Now, your experience of that image feels like one unified thing. You don't experience the redness separately, from the roundness separately from the texture of the wood, separately from the spatial relationship between the apple and the table. It all comes together into a single seamless moment of awareness. You see one scene, and that integration, that binding of all these different pieces of information into a unified whole, is something Tononi argues is fundamental to what consciousness actually is. It's not just that your brain is processing information. A digital camera processes information too, when it captures that same image. The difference is that in your brain, all that information is deeply interconnected. The redness affects the shape, perception, affects the spatial awareness, affects the emotional associations, affects the memory retrieval. and all of it feeds back on itself in this incredibly dense web of mutual influence. The camera doesn't do that. The camera processes each pixel independently. There's no integration. So Tononi proposed a mathematical measure for this. He called it phi, using the Greek letter. And phi is supposed to quantify how much integrated information a system generates. High phi means lots of integration. Lots of parts that are deeply interconnected and mutually influencing each other in ways that can't be reduced to smaller, independent pieces. Low phi means the system is more modular, more decomposable, more like a collection of separate processes running side by side without really talking to each other. And here's the bold claim. Tononi suggested that phi doesn't just correlate with consciousness. He suggested that phi is consciousness, that any system with high phi, regardless of what it's made of, is conscious to some degree. And any system with zero phi, no matter how complex its behavior, is not conscious at all. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's a neat idea, but can you actually calculate this? Can you actually measure phi for a real brain? And this is where things get complicated in a way that's both frustrating and kind of fascinating. Because in principle, yes, phi is mathematically defined. Tononi and his collaborators, including Masafumi Oizumi and others, published increasingly rigorous formulations throughout the 2000s. But in practice, computing pi for anything larger than a very small system turns out to be computationally astronomical. We're talking about a calculation that scales so explosively with the number of elements that even calculating phi for a few dozen neurons would take longer than the age of the universe on current computers. So for a human brain with 86 billion neurons, forget it, not even close. But here's the thing, that computational intractability doesn't necessarily mean the theory is wrong. It might just mean we need clever shortcuts, approximations, indirect ways of getting at the same idea. And that's exactly what some researchers started working on. One of the most important of these efforts came from Tononi's longtime collaborator, Marcello Massimini, who's a neurophysiologist at the University of Milan. And Massimini's approach was wonderfully practical. Instead of trying to calculate phi directly, he figured out a way to probe the brain's integration empirically, using a technique that sounds almost comically simple when you first hear about it. Basically, he decided to knock on the brain and listen to the echo. Here's how it works. You use transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, which is just a way of sending a brief magnetic pulse into a specific spot on the brain surface, and then you record the brain's electrical response using EEG, those electrodes on the scalp. So you zap one spot, and then you watch what happens. Does the electrical activity stay local, just rippling around the area you stimulated? Or does it spread out across the brain in complex, differentiated patterns that involve lots of different regions interacting with each other? Massimini and his team found something remarkable. When you do this to someone who's awake and conscious, the brain's response is complex and widespread. The electrical echo bounces around, reverberates, creates these intricate patterns that are different every time, depending on where you stimulate. The brain is integrated. All the parts are talking to each other in rich, unpredictable ways. But when you do the same thing to someone in deep, dreamless sleep or under general anesthesia, the response is completely different. The electrical activity either stays local, just a brief blip near where you zapped, or it spreads out but in a simple stereotyped wave, like dropping a stone in still water. No complexity, no differentiation. The brain has become, in a sense, disconnected from itself. The parts are still there, the neurons are still alive, but they're not integrating information anymore. And that's exactly what Tononi's theory predicts. Consciousness should track with integration. High integration, you're conscious. Low integration, you're not. And Massimini's zap and listen technique, which they formalized into something called the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI, turned out to be remarkably good at distinguishing conscious from unconscious states. They tested it on people under different types of anesthesia, people in various stages of sleep, and crucially, people with severe brain injuries, patients in vegetative states or minimally conscious states, where the clinical question of whether someone is actually aware is desperately, heartbreakingly important. And the PCI could distinguish between these states with striking accuracy. They published key results around 2013 and continued refining the approach. It was, in a very real sense, one of the first practical consciousness detectors. Now, let's sit with that for a moment, because it connects back to something we were talking about earlier. The whole challenge of the Cambridge Declaration was that it could say these animals probably have the substrates for consciousness, but it couldn't actually test for consciousness directly. And here was a technique that could at least detect the difference between conscious and unconscious states in humans. So the obvious question is, could you use something like this on animals? And the answer is, it's complicated. The TMSEEG approach requires a certain kind of brain anatomy and a cooperative subject who holds still while you zap their skull. It's been adapted for some animal work. There have been studies in rats and primates, but it's not straightforward to extend to, say, an octopus or a honeybee. And this gets at a deeper tension in the whole field of animal consciousness research. Most of our tools were designed for human brains. Our theories are built on human introspection. Our intuitions about what consciousness looks like are shaped by our own experience of having it. And every time we try to extend these frameworks to other species, we run into the problem that their nervous systems, their bodies, their sensory worlds are so different from ours that our tools might not even be asking the right questions. But let's come back to integrated information theory for a moment, because there's another implication of Tononi's framework that generated enormous controversy, and it's one of those ideas that sounds crazy at first, but has a weird internal logic that's hard to dismiss. If consciousness is identical to integrated information, and if phi can be non-zero in any system that integrates information, not just brains, then consciousness isn't limited to biological organisms. A thermostat has a tiny, tiny amount of integrated information. A photodiode has some. Even simple physical systems, by this logic, would have some vanishingly small flicker of experience. This is panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the physical world, present to some degree in all matter. And Tononi doesn't shy away from it. He said explicitly that yes, his theory implies a form of panpsychism, and he considers that a feature, not a bug. You can imagine how this went over. Many neuroscientists and philosophers recoiled. Scott Aronson, the computer scientist, published a sharp critique pointing out that under certain formulations of IIT, you could construct simple systems, like a grid of logic gates, that would have astronomically high phi despite clearly not being conscious in any meaningful sense. Tononi responded, refinements were made, debates continued, and this is where the field sits in some ways, caught between theories that are mathematically elegant but possibly too inclusive, and theories that are more conservative but might miss the very thing they're trying to explain. Because running alongside IIT, there's been another major theoretical framework competing for attention, and it comes from a very different intellectual tradition. This is global workspace theory, originally proposed by the cognitive scientist Bernard Baars back in the late 1980s, and later given a more rigorous neuroscientific grounding by Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux in France. And where IT starts from the mathematics of information and works outward, global workspace theory starts from what we actually observe happening in brains when people become conscious of something. The metaphor Baars used is a theater. Imagine your brain as a darkened theater. There's a stage with a spotlight, and there's a vast audience sitting in the darkness. At any given moment, enormous amounts of processing are happening in the audience. Unconscious processing, all those specialized modules doing their thing, recognizing faces, parsing grammar, monitoring your heartbeat, processing visual edges. But only a small amount of that information makes it onto the stage, into the spotlight. And when something enters the spotlight, when it becomes the content of your conscious awareness, it gets broadcast to the entire audience. Everyone can see it. Every module has access to it. That broadcasting, that global availability of information across the brain, is what consciousness is, according to this theory. Dehaene took this metaphor and grounded it in actual neural mechanisms. He and his colleagues identified what they called a global neuronal workspace, a network of neurons, primarily in the prefrontal and parietal cortex, with long-range connections that can link distant brain regions together. When information crosses a certain threshold of activation and enters this workspace, it gets broadcast widely, and that's the moment you become conscious of it. Below that threshold, the information is processed, but never reaches awareness. And Dehaene's group gathered impressive experimental evidence for this. They used a technique called masking, flashing an image very briefly on a screen and then immediately covering it with another image, and showed that when the first image was too brief to reach conscious awareness, it still activated early visual areas of the brain. The information was being processed. But it never ignited the global workspace, never got broadcast, and the person had no conscious experience of seeing it. Increase the display time just a tiny bit past a critical threshold, and suddenly the whole prefrontal cortex lights up, the information goes global, and the person says, "Yes, I saw it." Now, what's interesting about global workspace theory from the perspective of animal consciousness is that it gives you something concrete to look for. You can ask, does this animal's brain have the kind of long-range connectivity that would support a global workspace? Does information get broadcast widely when the animal attends to something? And for mammals and birds, the answer seems to be yes. There are analogous networks, long-range connections, similar patterns of widespread activation during tasks that seem to require awareness. For insects, it's less clear, but not obviously impossible. There's been work suggesting that even the insect brain, tiny as it is, has a kind of central integration hub that might serve a similar function. But here's where the rivalry between these two theories gets really interesting and really consequential for how we think about animal minds. Because IT and global workspace theory make different predictions about what kinds of systems can be conscious. IIT says consciousness is about integration, period. It doesn't matter where in the brain it happens. It doesn't require a prefrontal cortex. It doesn't require any particular architecture. A system with the right pattern of integration is conscious. Full stop. Global workspace theory says consciousness requires a specific kind of architecture. You need that broadcasting mechanism, those long-range connections, that ignition event. And this means they disagree about some really important cases. What about a patient in a vegetative state whose prefrontal cortex is damaged, but whose posterior cortex is still highly integrated? IIT might say they're conscious. Global workspace theory might say they're not. What about a bee with no prefrontal cortex at all, but with a brain that integrates information in its own way? Again, the theories diverge, and by the mid-2000s, this rivalry had become one of the defining tensions in consciousness science. Both camps had smart people, good data, and compelling arguments. And a group of researchers decided to do something unusual, something that science doesn't do nearly often enough. They decided to put the two theories to a direct adversarial test. The project was called Cogitate, and it was part of a larger initiative funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and the idea was beautifully simple in concept even if fiendishly complex in execution. Get proponents of both theories to agree in advance on experiments whose results would clearly favor one theory over the other. Pre-register the predictions. Run the experiments. See who's right. And the first results from these adversarial collaborations started coming out around 2023, and they were not what anyone expected. They were messy, they were surprising, and in a way, they were exactly what science needed. So here's what happened. The adversarial collaboration involved multiple experiments, but one of the key ones used neuroimaging, functional MRI and EEG together, to watch what happens in the brain when people consciously perceive something versus when they don't. The idea was to look at where in the brain the signature of consciousness shows up. Because IIT predicts that the neural correlates of consciousness should be found in the posterior cortex, the back of the brain, where you've got all that rich, highly interconnected sensory processing happening. Tononi and his colleagues had been arguing for years that the posterior hot zone, as they called it, is where the real integration happens, where the phi is highest. The prefrontal cortex, in their view, might be involved in reporting what you're conscious of, but it's not where consciousness itself lives. Global workspace theory makes a very different prediction. It says that when you become conscious of something, you should see that global ignition, that burst of activity spreading from sensory areas into the prefrontal and parietal networks. The frontal cortex should light up. That's the broadcasting. That's the workspace going online. So the experiment was designed to distinguish between these two predictions. And when the results came out, the first major report was presented at the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness meeting in 2023. Neither theory got a clean win. The data showed sustained activity in the posterior cortex during conscious perception, which was consistent with IIT's predictions. But the massive prefrontal ignition that global workspace theory predicted, it was weaker than expected. Not entirely absent, but not the dramatic, unmistakable signature that Dehaene and his colleagues had described. The results seemed to lean toward IIT on some measures and toward neither theory on others. Now, you have to be careful here. This was one set of experiments, and the researchers themselves were cautious about over-interpreting. But the reaction in the field was fascinating. Some people saw it as a vindication of IIT. Others pointed out that the experiments might not have been the right kind to trigger the full global workspace response. And still others, and this is the group I find most interesting, started saying, look, maybe both theories are capturing something real, but neither one is the whole story. Maybe consciousness isn't a single thing that one theory can explain. Maybe it's more like a constellation of related phenomena, and different theories illuminate different parts of it. And here's the thing. This matters enormously for the question we've been circling around all night, which is animal consciousness. Because if IIT is more on the right track, then consciousness is far more widespread in the animal kingdom than most scientists assumed even a decade ago. If what matters is integrated information in the posterior cortex or its equivalent, then any animal with a sufficiently integrated nervous system, bees, octopuses, maybe even simpler creatures, could have some form of experience. But if global workspace theory is closer to the truth, then consciousness requires a specific kind of neural architecture, and you'd expect it to be more limited, more tied to the kinds of brains that have those long-range broadcasting connections. So the stakes of this theoretical rivalry aren't just academic. They determine which animals we think deserve moral consideration. They shape laws, policies, farming practices, research ethics. The question of whether a lobster feels pain when you drop it in boiling water, that's not just a philosophical puzzle. It's a question that hinges, in part, on which theory of consciousness you find most persuasive. And this brings us to something that happened in the policy world that was directly influenced by this kind of science. In 2021, the United Kingdom was debating an update to its animal welfare bill, and a group of researchers from the London School of Economics, led by Jonathan Birch, a philosopher of biology, were commissioned to review the evidence on sentience in Decapod crustaceans and Cephalopod mollusks, lobsters, crabs, shrimp, octopuses, squid. The question was straightforward. Is there sufficient evidence that these animals can feel pain and suffering to warrant legal protection? Now, Jonathan Birch is someone worth knowing about. He'd been working on the philosophy of animal sentience for years, and he'd developed a framework for evaluating sentience evidence that was rigorous without being impossibly demanding. His approach was to look at multiple lines of evidence: behavioral, neurological, pharmacological, and assess the overall weight of the case. You don't need to prove consciousness with mathematical certainty. You need to assess the balance of evidence and act accordingly. And his team's report, published in November 2021, concluded that there was strong enough evidence of sentience in decapods and cephalopods to extend the protections of the Animal Welfare Bill to cover them. Think about what that means. The British government, based on scientific evidence about nervous system architecture and behavioral responses to pain, legally recognized that crabs and octopuses are sentient beings. The Animal Welfare, Sentience Act 2022 included them. And this wasn't just symbolic. It had practical implications for how these animals could be transported, stored, and killed in commercial settings. But here's where it gets complicated, and honestly, where it gets a little uncomfortable. Because the evidence for sentience in these animals is real, but it's also genuinely uncertain. Take crabs. When you apply a noxious stimulus to a crab, an electric shock, say, it will change its behavior to avoid that stimulus in the future. It will trade off competing motivations, choosing a less preferred shelter to avoid a shelter where it previously got shocked. That looks a lot like pain. But is it pain as you and I experience it? Is there something it's like to be that crab, feeling that shock? Or is it a sophisticated nociceptive response, a reflex system that produces avoidance behavior without any accompanying experience? And this is where the hard problem rears its head again. Remember Chalmers and that gap between function and experience? This is exactly that gap, playing out in a policy context. We can observe the behavior. We can study the nervous system. We can see that crabs have nociceptors, that they have opioid receptors, that analgesics change their responses to noxious stimuli. All of that is suggestive, but none of it definitively tells us whether there's an inner experience happening. Birch's framework handles this by treating it as a risk assessment problem rather than a certainty problem. You don't wait until you're absolutely sure an animal is sentient before you protect it. You look at the evidence, you assess the probability, and you act proportionally. It's the same logic we use in engineering safety, actually. You don't wait for the bridge to collapse before you reinforce it. You assess the risk and act accordingly. And this precautionary approach has been gaining traction. The New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, which came out in April 2024, was signed by a broad group of researchers, neuroscientists, philosophers, biologists, and it stated that there is strong scientific support for attributing conscious experience to mammals and birds, and at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates, including reptiles, amphibians, and fish, as well as in many invertebrates, including insects and cephalopods. That's a remarkable statement. Not because it claims certainty, it doesn't, but because it shifts the burden. It says the evidence is strong enough that we should take the possibility seriously. Now, let's slow down for a moment and talk about one of the most fascinating and contentious areas in this whole debate, which is fish. Fish consciousness has been one of the most heated battlegrounds in animal sentience research, and the story of how the scientific consensus shifted is genuinely dramatic. For most of the 20th century, the default assumption was that fish don't feel pain. They don't have the neocortex, which was considered the seat of conscious experience in mammals. Their brains are small and structurally different. They're cold-blooded. They're aquatic. They're alien to us in so many ways. And there was a powerful economic incentive to maintain this view. The global fishing industry is enormous, and the idea that fish might suffer has massive implications for commercial fishing, aquaculture, and recreational angling. But then, in 2003, a researcher named Lynn Sneddon at the University of Liverpool published a paper that changed the conversation. Sneddon and her colleagues injected bee venom or acetic acid into the lips of rainbow trout, which sounds awful, and it kind of is, but this is how you study pain responses. And they observed a suite of behaviors that went far beyond simple reflexes. The fish rocked back and forth on the substrate. They rubbed their lips against the gravel and the walls of the tank. Their breathing rate increased. And most tellingly, these anomalous behaviors persisted for hours, much longer than you'd expect from a simple nociceptive reflex, which typically produces a quick withdrawal and then stops. Sneddon also showed that when you gave the fish morphine, these behaviors were reduced. The analgesic worked, and in subsequent experiments, she demonstrated that fish in pain would pay costs to get relief. They'd enter areas of the tank they normally avoided if those areas contained analgesic-laced water. That's not a reflex. That's a motivated behavior, a trade-off, a decision that suggests the fish is experiencing something aversive and is willing to sacrifice other preferences to make it stop. The pushback was fierce. A prominent group of researchers, including James Rose, a neurobiologist at the University of Wyoming, argued that fish lack the neural architecture necessary for conscious pain experience. Rose pointed out that fish don't have a neocortex, and he argued that without a neocortex, you can't have the kind of neural processing that generates subjective experience. The behavioral responses Sneddon observed, he contended, could be explained by nociceptive processing in subcortical structures, real neural activity, but not conscious pain. And here's where the debate connects back to everything we've been talking about. Because Rose's argument depends on a specific assumption about the neural requirements for consciousness, namely, that you need a neocortex or something very like it, and that assumption was being challenged on multiple fronts simultaneously. The work on bird cognition, the avian brain renaming, the neuron density findings, All of that was showing that you don't need a mammalian cortex to produce complex cognition. And if corvids and parrots can demonstrate sophisticated cognitive abilities with a brain organized completely differently from a mammal's, then maybe the neocortex isn't as special as Rose assumed. By the 2000s, more and more researchers were coming around to the view that fish probably do experience something when they're subjected to noxious stimuli. Not necessarily pain exactly as humans experience it, we can't know that, but some form of negative subjective experience. Victoria Braithwaite, a biologist at Penn State, wrote a whole book about it in 2010. Do fish feel pain? And her conclusion, after reviewing all the evidence, was yes, they almost certainly do. Braithwaite passed away in 2019, but her work had already helped shift the scientific conversation substantially, and the implications keep rippling outward. If fish are sentient, what does that mean for the roughly 1 to 3 trillion wild fish killed by commercial fishing every year? That number is so large it's almost incomprehensible. We don't even count fish as individuals. We measure them in tons. And if each of those fish has some form of subjective experience, some capacity to suffer, then the scale of suffering involved in global fisheries is staggering. But let's pull back from the policy implications for a moment, because there's a deeper scientific question here that I find endlessly fascinating, and it has to do with the evolution of consciousness itself. Because if consciousness is present in fish and in insects and in cephalopods, groups that diverged from our lineage hundreds of millions of years ago, then we have to ask, when did consciousness first evolve? Did it evolve once, very early, in some common ancestor? Or did it evolve independently, multiple times, in different lineages? And this question takes us into some of the most speculative and exciting territory in all of consciousness science, because it connects to something we touched on earlier: convergent evolution. Remember how we talked about birds and mammals independently evolving similar cognitive abilities despite having very different brain architectures? Well, what if consciousness itself is a case of convergent evolution? What if it's such a useful adaptation that evolution has stumbled upon it again and again in different ways, in different lineages? There's a researcher named Todd Feinberg, a neurologist at the Econ School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, who's been thinking about exactly this question, and his work with the biologist John Mallett has produced one of the most ambitious attempts to trace the evolutionary origins of consciousness. Their argument, laid out in a 2016 book called The Ancient Origins of Consciousness, is that the basic neural architecture required for subjective experience evolved very early, possibly in the Cambrian period, around 540 million years ago, when the first complex animals were appearing in the fossil record. And what Feinberg and Mallett did was really clever. They didn't try to find consciousness by looking for some single magic ingredient, some one brain structure or one type of neuron. Instead, they asked a more practical question. What are the minimum neural features that would allow an organism to create a unified, subjective model of its world? And they identified a set of criteria, things like a nervous system complex enough to integrate multiple sensory inputs into a single coherent image, the ability to map the body's relationship to the environment, and what they called isomorphic representations, which is a fancy way of saying the brain creates an internal map that structurally mirrors the external world in some useful way. Think about what that means. When you see a red apple on a table, your brain isn't just registering raw light wavelengths. It's constructing a unified scene. There's an object. It has a color. It has a shape. It's sitting on a surface at a particular distance from you. That construction, that binding together of different sensory streams into one coherent experience, is something Feinberg and Malat argue is a hallmark of consciousness. And here's what's really interesting. When they looked at the fossil record and at the nervous systems of living animals to figure out when that kind of neural complexity first appeared, they landed squarely in the Cambrian explosion. That incredible burst of animal diversification that happened around 540 to 520 million years ago, when suddenly, in geological terms, means over maybe 20 million years, the oceans went from being populated mostly by simple, soft-bodied creatures to being filled with animals that had eyes and jaws and shells and claws and all the complex body plans we recognize today. And Feinberg and Malat's argument is that this wasn't a coincidence. The Cambrian explosion was, among other things, an arms race. Once some organisms evolved eyes, even simple ones, they could detect predators and prey at a distance, and that changed everything. Suddenly, there was enormous evolutionary pressure to process visual information quickly, to integrate it with other senses, to make fast decisions about whether to flee or to strike. And that pressure, they argue, drove the evolution of increasingly complex nervous systems complex enough to generate the first flickers of subjective experience, the first crude forms of consciousness. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is genuinely speculative territory. We can't run experiments on animals that have been extinct for 500 million years. What Feinberg and Malat did was look at the nervous systems of the most ancient living vertebrates, like lampreys, those eel-like jawless fish that diverged from our lineage somewhere around 500 million years ago. And they found that even lampreys have surprisingly complex brains. Lampreys have a layered optic tectum, which is the brain structure that creates spatial maps of the visual world. They have a pallium, a forerunner of the cerebral cortex. They have the basic neural machinery for integrating sensory information into something that looks, at least architecturally, like it could support a unified experience. And if lampreys have this machinery, and they diverged from other vertebrates so long ago, then the implication is that the common ancestor of all vertebrates, some small, soft-bodied creature swimming in Cambrian seas, probably had it too. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and this connects back to something we've been circling around for a while now. What about invertebrates? What about arthropods, insects, crustaceans, spiders? What about those octopuses we talked about earlier? Because arthropods diverged from the vertebrate lineage even earlier, back before the Cambrian explosion really got going. And yet, as we've seen, insects show remarkably sophisticated behaviors. Bees can learn abstract concepts. Fruit flies show something that looks like attention. Crayfish show anxiety-like responses to stress. And octopuses, well, we've already talked about how extraordinary they are. So Feinberg and Malat looked at arthropods too, and they found that many arthropods also have the kind of neural architecture they identified as necessary for consciousness. Insects have a structure called the central complex that creates spatial maps. They have mushroom bodies that integrate multiple sensory streams. The neural circuitry is organized completely differently from a vertebrate brain. It's built from different evolutionary raw materials, but it does functionally similar things. And this is where convergent evolution comes roaring back into the picture. Because what Feinberg and Malat are suggesting is that consciousness may have evolved independently in at least two major lineages, vertebrates and arthropods, and possibly in cephalopods as a third independent origin. Three separate inventions of subjective experience, using different neural hardware driven by similar evolutionary pressures. It's like how wings evolved independently in birds, bats, and insects, completely different structures, same functional solution to the same problem. Except in this case, the problem being solved isn't flight. It's the creation of an internal model of the world that's rich enough and unified enough to guide complex, flexible behavior. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how would we ever test this? How do you confirm or deny that a lamprey or a Cambrian trilobite had subjective experience? And honestly, that's a fair challenge. This is one of those areas where the science bumps right up against the hard problem that David Chalmers articulated. You can map every neuron in an animal's brain, you can trace every circuit, and you still can't directly observe whether there's something it's like to be that animal. But what researchers like Feinberg and Malott have done is shift the question from an impossible one, prove that this animal is conscious, to a more tractable one. Does this animal have the kind of neural organization that, in animals we're more confident about, is associated with consciousness? It's not proof, but it's a principled way of making educated guesses, and it's a lot better than just assuming that consciousness requires a human-style cerebral cortex. And this evolutionary perspective has some profound implications that I think are worth sitting with for a moment. Because if consciousness really did evolve in the Cambrian, or even earlier, then it's not some recent, fragile, uniquely human achievement. It's ancient. It's been around for over 500 million years. It predates flowers. It predates dinosaurs. It predates the colonization of land. Some form of subjective experience may have been flickering in the oceans of Earth before any creature had ever set foot, or fin, or leg on dry ground. There's something both humbling and kind of magnificent about that idea, and it connects to a question that's been gaining a lot of attention in recent years, which is the question of insect consciousness. Because if Feinberg and Malott are right that arthropods crossed the threshold into some form of subjective experience, then we're not just talking about bees and crayfish. We're talking about the most species-rich group of animals on the planet. There are something like 10 quintillion individual insects alive at any given moment. That's a 1 followed by 19 zeros. And the question of whether any of them have experiences, whether any of them can suffer, has enormous implications. There's a researcher named Lars Chitka at Queen Mary University of London who's been at the forefront of this work. Chitka has spent decades studying bumblebee cognition, and his findings are remarkable. His lab has shown that bees can learn to pull strings to access food, and then other bees can learn by watching them. Social learning in an insect. They've shown that bees can be trained to roll little balls to a target location, and they do it even when there's no food reward, which looks an awful lot like play behavior, in a bumblebee. His 2022 book, The Mind of a Bee, makes a careful, evidence-based case that bees have rich inner lives, that they experience something, even if that something is very different from human experience. And Chitka's work on bee emotions is particularly fascinating. His lab-designed experiments where bees were given an ambiguous stimulus, something that could be interpreted as either rewarding or threatening, and they found that bees who had recently received an unexpected treat, a little drop of sugar water, were more likely to interpret the ambiguous stimulus positively. They approached it faster, as if they were in an optimistic mood. And bees who had recently been shaken, simulating a predator attack, were more likely to interpret the same ambiguous stimulus negatively. This is exactly the kind of cognitive bias that, in mammals, we associate with emotional states. Optimism and pessimism in a creature with fewer than 1 million neurons. For comparison, you have roughly 86 billion. But here's the thing that really keeps me thinking about all of this late at night. If we accept that consciousness might be widespread, that it might be present in fish, in insects, in cephalopods, in crustaceans, then we're forced to confront a really uncomfortable question about how we organize our world. Because modern civilization is built on a set of assumptions about which creatures matter and which don't, which ones deserve moral consideration, and which ones are just resources to be used. And those assumptions were shaped, in large part, by the Cartesian view we talked about way back at the beginning. The idea that animals are biological machines, that their behaviors are just reflexes, that there's nobody home. If that view is wrong, and the evidence increasingly suggests it is, then we have a lot of rethinking to do. And this rethinking is already happening in ways both large and small. We talked about the UK's Animal Welfare Sentience Act covering decapods and cephalopods, but there are other developments too. In 2023, the European Food Safety Authority began reviewing the welfare of farmed insects, because insect farming is being promoted as a sustainable protein source, and if insects are sentient, then how we farm them matters. Think about that for a second. We're simultaneously scaling up insect farming as a solution to food sustainability and discovering that the insects we're farming might have inner lives. The ethical questions are arriving faster than the science can answer them. And this tension between what we're learning about animal minds and how we actually treat animals is something that a philosopher named Peter Godfrey Smith has written about beautifully. Godfrey Smith is a philosopher of science at the University of Sydney, and he's also a scuba diver who has spent years observing octopuses in the wild off the coast of Australia. His 2016 book, Other Minds, is one of the most thoughtful explorations of animal consciousness I've ever encountered, and one of the things he emphasizes is just how alien octopus consciousness must be compared to ours, because octopuses have about 2/3 of their neurons in their arms, not in their central brain. Each arm has a degree of autonomous control. It can taste, it can touch, it can make decisions about how to move and what to grasp, even when severed from the body. So if an octopus is conscious, what is its consciousness like? Is it one unified experience, the way ours seems to be? Or is it something more distributed, more fragmented, more like a committee than a single self? Godfrey Smith calls the octopus the closest thing we have to meeting an intelligent alien. And I love that framing, because it captures something important. The challenge of understanding animal consciousness isn't just about figuring out which animals have it. It's about grappling with the possibility that consciousness comes in forms so different from our own that we might not even recognize them. That the inner life of an octopus, or a bee, or a fish might be so profoundly unlike human experience that our usual categories, pain, pleasure, fear, joy, might not map onto it cleanly at all. And yet, something is happening in there. Some form of experience is unfolding. The lights are on, even if the room looks nothing like ours. And this brings us to one of the most recent and, I think, most important developments in this whole field, the question of how we should actually study consciousness across species, given all these challenges. Because the traditional approach has been to take tests and paradigms designed for humans, or at least for primates, and try to adapt them for other animals. The mirror test is a perfect example. It was designed around visual self-recognition, which is something that matters a lot to highly visual primates, but might be completely irrelevant to an animal that navigates the world primarily through smell or echolocation or electrical fields. And researchers are increasingly recognizing that this approach has been biased from the start, that we've been grading every animal on a test designed for a species that happens to have forward-facing eyes and hands that can touch its own face. And when you put it that way, it sounds almost absurd, doesn't it? Like judging a dolphin's intelligence by how well it climbs a tree. So what does a better approach look like? Well, this is where things have gotten genuinely exciting in the last decade or so, because a whole generation of researchers has started building what you might call species-fair testing. Experiments designed around what each animal actually does, how it actually perceives its world, what actually matters to it. And the results have been remarkable. Not because they've answered the big question of consciousness once and for all, but because they've revealed cognitive and experiential capacities in animals that nobody expected. Take dogs, for instance. For a long time, dogs failed the mirror test, and that was sort of taken as evidence that they lacked self-awareness. But think about that for a second. Dogs don't really care about mirrors. They sniff them once, maybe, and move on. Their world is built on smell. So in 2017, a researcher named Alexandra Horowitz at Barnard College designed what she called a sniff test of self-recognition. She presented dogs with canisters containing their own urine versus modified versions of their own urine. Their scent with something added to it. And what she found was that dogs spent significantly more time investigating the modified version of their own scent, the way a primate might spend more time looking at a modified version of its own reflection. The dogs knew their own smell. They noticed when something about it had changed. That's self-recognition. It's just happening in a completely different sensory channel than the one we were testing. Or consider elephants. Elephants do pass the traditional mirror test, actually. A 2006 study by Joshua Plotnick, Franz de Waal, and Diana Rice showed an Asian elephant named Happy at the Bronx Zoo, touching a mark on her own head that she could only see in a mirror. But here's the thing. Only a small fraction of elephants tested actually do the mark-touching behavior. Does that mean most elephants aren't self-aware? That seems unlikely, given everything else we know about elephant cognition, their complex social structures, their apparent mourning behaviors, their long memories, their ability to cooperate on tasks that require understanding what another elephant is doing. It's more likely that most elephants just aren't that interested in mirrors, or they express their self-awareness in ways the test doesn't capture. Maybe they recognize themselves just fine, but didn't care about the mark. We don't know, and that uncertainty is itself informative. And this is where a researcher named Franz de Waal, who keeps showing up in this story because he's been central to so many of these conversations, made a really important conceptual move. In his 2016 book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?, de Waal argued that the history of animal cognition research is essentially a history of us underestimating animals because of poorly designed tests. He called it anthropocentrism in methodology. The idea is simple but profound. If you test a fish on its ability to use tools the way a chimpanzee uses tools, the fish will fail, and you'll conclude the fish is cognitively simple. But you haven't actually learned anything about the fish. You've learned that the fish isn't a chimpanzee. De Waal pushed for what he called evolutionary cognition, studying each species' intelligence on its own terms, in the context of the ecological problems it actually needs to solve. And when researchers started doing this more rigorously, the map of animal cognition exploded. Suddenly, species that had been dismissed as simple turned out to be doing extraordinary things. Cleaner rasa, tiny fish that clean parasites off larger fish on coral reefs, were shown in 2019 by Masanori Koda and colleagues to pass a modified version of the mirror test. These are fish with brains smaller than a pea. The study was controversial, and some researchers argued the fish might have been responding to the mark as a parasite rather than truly recognizing themselves. But the debate itself was revealing because it forced the field to ask, what do we actually mean by self-recognition? What counts? And who gets to decide? Here's where the philosophy and the science really start to tangle together in a way that I find fascinating. Because when you're trying to study consciousness in another species, you face a problem that's genuinely different from most scientific problems. In most of science, you can at least agree on what you're measuring. You might argue about the best way to measure the mass of a star, but everyone agrees that mass is a thing that exists and can, in principle, be quantified. With consciousness, you can't even do that. You're trying to detect the presence of subjective experience, the felt quality of being, in a system that can't tell you whether it has any. And every behavioral test you design, no matter how clever, is ultimately an inference. You're watching the outside and trying to guess about the inside. This is why Jonathan Birch, the philosopher at the London School of Economics whose work on sentience we touched on earlier, has argued for what he calls a precautionary framework. His idea, which he laid out in detail in his 2024 book, The Edge of Sentience, is that we shouldn't wait for certainty before extending moral consideration. Instead, we should look at the totality of evidence, behavioral, neurological, evolutionary, and ask whether there are credible indicators of sentience. If there are, we should act on that possibility, even if we can't prove it definitively. He's not saying every organism is sentient. He's saying the cost of being wrong in one direction, treating a sentient being as if it can't feel, is much worse than the cost of being wrong in the other direction. And this precautionary approach has actually started to reshape policy, which is something that doesn't happen very often with abstract philosophical arguments. Remember the UK Animal Welfare, Sentience, Act from 2022? That legislation was directly informed by Birch's review of the sentience evidence for decapod crustaceans and cephalopods. Lobsters and octopuses got legal recognition as sentient beings, at least in UK law, because a philosopher looked at the evidence carefully and said, "We can't be certain, but the indicators are strong enough that we should err on the side of caution." That's a remarkable thing. A philosophical argument about the nature of consciousness changed how a country treats crabs. And it's not just the UK. The European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, has been grappling with similar questions, particularly around insect farming. As the farmed insect industry has grown, we're talking about billions of black soldier fly larvae, mealworms, crickets being raised for animal feed and increasingly for human food. The question of whether these insects can suffer has gone from a philosophical curiosity to an urgent practical problem. If Chitka's bumblebees show signs of emotional states, if insects have the neural architecture for something like experience, then an industry that processes them by the billions has a welfare problem it needs to address. The 2023 EFSA review tried to assess the evidence, and the honest answer was, we don't know enough. But we don't know is different from they don't feel anything. And the gap between those two statements is exactly where the precautionary principle lives. Now, you might be lying there thinking, this is all very interesting, but does it really change anything? Does knowing that a bee might have a flicker of experience actually alter how we live? And I think the honest answer is, it's starting to, slowly, unevenly, with a lot of resistance and a lot of uncertainty, but it's starting to. The 2024 New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, which brought together philosophers, neuroscientists, and biologists to state publicly that there is strong evidence for consciousness in mammals and birds, and credible evidence for it in all vertebrates and many invertebrates. That declaration was a signal. It was the scientific community saying, "We've been too cautious about this for too long. The evidence has been accumulating for decades, and it's time to take it seriously." And what makes this moment different from previous waves of interest in animal minds, different from the romantic anthropomorphism of the 19th century, different from the cognitive revolution of the 1960s and 70s, is that it's grounded in multiple independent lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion. You've got the behavioral evidence from researchers like Goodall and Dewall and Chitka. You've got the neuroanatomical evidence from people like Olkowicz showing that bird brains pack enormous numbers of neurons into small spaces. You've got the evolutionary arguments from Feinberg and Malott pushing consciousness back to the Cambrian. You've got the philosophical frameworks from Birch and Godfrey Smith and others providing rigorous ways to think about degrees and forms of sentience. And you've got the neuroscience of consciousness itself, the integrated information theory, the global workspace theory, providing at least tentative frameworks for thinking about what physical systems might generate experience. None of these lines of evidence is conclusive on its own. Each one has gaps, critics, limitations, but together they paint a picture that's hard to dismiss. And the picture is this: consciousness is probably not a rare, special thing that evolution invented once for humans, or even once for mammals. It's more likely something that has arisen multiple times, in multiple lineages, in multiple forms. It might be woven into the fabric of complex nervous systems, the way metabolism is woven into the fabric of living cells, not as an optional add-on, but as something that emerges naturally when information processing reaches a certain kind of complexity and integration. And if that's true, if consciousness is widespread, ancient, and varied, then we're living in a world that is far richer in experience than we've traditionally assumed. Every backyard, every pond, every coral reef is teeming not just with life, but with lives, with perspectives, with something it is like to be. The sparrow at your window isn't just a feathered automaton executing genetic programs. It has a point of view. The world looks like something to it. And that thought, once you really let it settle in, changes the texture of everything around you. But it also raises a question that I think is the deepest and most unsettling one in this whole conversation. A question that takes us beyond animals altogether, into territory that might seem like science fiction, but is actually being debated right now in serious academic journals and government policy discussions. And that question is, if consciousness can arise in biological nervous systems of vastly different designs, in mammal brains and bird brains and octopus brains and maybe even insect brains, then what about non-biological systems? What about machines? It's a question that sounds like it belongs in a movie, but it's one that some of the sharpest minds in consciousness research are wrestling with right now, and it connects directly to everything we've been talking about tonight. Because here's the thing, if you've followed the thread of this conversation, you've watched the boundaries of consciousness expand, step by step, from humans to great apes, from great apes to mammals generally, from mammals to birds, from birds to fish, from fish to octopuses, from octopuses, maybe even to insects. And at each step, the argument for expansion has followed the same basic logic. Look at the behavior, look at the neural architecture, look at the evolutionary pressures, and ask whether the evidence is consistent with some form of inner experience. The boundaries kept moving outward because the evidence kept pointing outward. So the question naturally arises, does that expansion have a stopping point? And if it does, what defines the boundary? This is where things get genuinely difficult because the frameworks we've been exploring all night start to diverge in their predictions. Take integrated information theory, Tononi's IIT, which we talked about earlier. Remember, IIT says that consciousness is identical to integrated information, this quantity called phi. If a system has high phi, meaning its parts are both differentiated in their responses and deeply integrated with each other, then that system is conscious. Period. It doesn't matter what the system is made of. It doesn't matter whether it's carbon-based biology or silicon chips or something else entirely. What matters is the mathematical structure of the information processing. And that's a remarkable claim, because it means that in principle, an artificial system could be conscious if it had the right architecture. Not because it was pretending to be conscious, not because it was saying the right words, but because the actual informational structure of the system generated genuine experience. Now, global workspace theory, Dehaene and Bars's framework, points in a somewhat similar direction, though for different reasons. If consciousness is what happens when information gets broadcast widely across a system, made available to multiple processing modules simultaneously, then again, there's nothing in that definition that restricts it to biological tissue. You could imagine an artificial system with a global workspace architecture where information gets selected and broadcast and made available for flexible, context-sensitive behavior. Would that system be conscious? GWT doesn't give you a firm reason to say no, but here's where it gets really interesting and really contentious. There are serious thinkers who argue that current artificial intelligence systems, the large language models, the systems you interact with when you use chatbots or AI assistants, might already have some form of experience. And there are equally serious thinkers who say that's absurd, that these systems are fundamentally the wrong kind of thing to be conscious, no matter how sophisticated their outputs become. And the disagreement isn't just a matter of opinion. It reflects genuinely different philosophical commitments about what consciousness is and what it requires. Let's think about this carefully, because it connects back to almost everything we've covered. The large language models that have captured so much public attention in recent years, systems like GPT-4 and its successors, are at their core pattern matching engines trained on vast amounts of text. They predict the next word in a sequence, over and over, and they do it with extraordinary sophistication. They can write poetry, answer questions, hold conversations that feel remarkably natural. But the question is whether any of that implies inner experience. And the honest answer is, we don't know. We genuinely don't know. And the reason we don't know connects directly to the hard problem that David Chalmers identified back in the 1990s. You can describe every functional property of a system, what it does, how it processes information, what outputs it generates, and you still haven't explained why there's something it's like to be that system. The explanatory gap doesn't go away just because the system is impressive. There's a thought experiment that I think captures this beautifully. It was proposed by the philosopher John Searle back in 1980, long before anyone was thinking about modern AI, and it's called the Chinese room. Imagine you're locked in a room. People slide pieces of paper under the door with Chinese characters written on them. You don't speak Chinese. You have no idea what the characters mean. But you have an enormous rule book, a set of instructions that tells you, for any sequence of Chinese characters you receive, exactly which Chinese characters to write on a new piece of paper and slide back out. From the outside, it looks like the room understands Chinese. The responses are perfect. They're contextually appropriate, nuanced, even witty. But you, inside the room, understand nothing. You're just following rules. Searle's point was that syntax, the mechanical manipulation of symbols according to rules, is not sufficient for semantics, for actual understanding, for meaning. And by extension, a computer that manipulates symbols according to rules, no matter how complex those rules are, doesn't thereby understand anything. Now, this argument has been debated for over 4 decades, and there are powerful responses to it. Some people argue that while the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, the system as a whole, the person plus the rule book plus the room, does understand Chinese, in the same way that no individual neuron in your brain understands English, but your brain as a whole does. This is called the system's reply, and it's actually quite compelling if you think about it. After all, consciousness in your brain doesn't reside in any single neuron. It's an emergent property of the whole system. So why couldn't understanding emerge from the whole Chinese room system, even if no individual component understands anything? But Searle had a counter to this too. He said, "Fine, imagine I memorize the entire rule book. Now I am the system. I've internalized all the rules. I can take in Chinese characters and produce perfect responses without any external book. And I still don't understand Chinese. I'm still just manipulating symbols. The understanding isn't there. You can go back and forth on this. People have for decades. But the reason I bring it up is that it highlights something crucial about the consciousness debate as it applies to artificial systems. We don't have a reliable way to determine from the outside whether a system has inner experience. With animals, we at least have the argument from biological similarity. A dog's brain is made of the same stuff as yours, organized in broadly similar ways, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures. That gives you a reason to think the dog's information processing is accompanied by experience, because yours is, and the dog's system is relevantly similar to yours. But with an artificial system, that argument from biological similarity breaks down. The hardware is completely different. The processing architecture is completely different. The developmental history is completely different. So you're left with behavior and functional organization as your only evidence. And we've already established that behavior alone can't settle the question. This is why the 2024 New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, which we talked about earlier, is so carefully worded. It focuses on animals, on biological systems with evolutionary histories. It doesn't extend its claims to artificial systems, and that's deliberate. The signatories recognized that the evidence base for animal consciousness, while incomplete, rests on a combination of behavioral, neuroanatomical, and evolutionary arguments that simply don't apply in the same way to machines. But not everyone agrees that the biological substrate matters. If you take IIT seriously, then what matters is informational structure, not physical material. And some researchers have pointed out that this leads to some strange conclusions. Tononi himself has argued that certain simple systems, even a photodiode, which is basically just a light sensor, have a tiny, vanishingly small amount of integrated information, and therefore a tiny, vanishingly small amount of consciousness. Most people find that counterintuitive, to put it mildly, but Tononi would say that your intuitions aren't a reliable guide to the nature of consciousness. After all, Your intuitions once told you that fish couldn't feel pain and that insects were mere automatons, and look how those intuitions have held up. There's another angle on this that I find fascinating, and it comes from Murray Shanahan, a cognitive roboticist at Imperial College London who's thought deeply about both AI and consciousness. Shanahan has argued that we need to be very careful about the language we use when talking about AI systems. When a chatbot says, "I think," or "I feel," or "I understand," we naturally interpret those words through the lens of our own experience. We know what it's like for us to think, feel, and understand, so we project that experience onto the system. But the system learned to produce those words by predicting text patterns, not by having experiences. The words are, in a sense, empty. They're the right words, in the right order, but they may not be connected to anything like what those words mean when you say them. Shanahan calls this the role-play interpretation. The AI isn't expressing its inner states. It's playing the role of something that has inner states, because that's what the training data taught it to do. And yet, and this is the maddening part, you could make a similar argument about other humans. You've never directly experienced anyone else's consciousness. You infer it from their behavior, their words, their facial expressions, and from the fact that they're biologically similar to you. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, who we encountered earlier, spent much of his career arguing that consciousness just is a certain kind of information processing, a certain kind of functional organization, and that there's no further fact of the matter beyond that. If a system processes information in the right way, it's conscious. Full stop. There's no secret ingredient, no magic spark, no ghost in the machine. And if Dennett is right, then the question of machine consciousness becomes purely empirical. Does this system have the right functional organization, or doesn't it? Jonathan Birch, whose work on sentience and the precautionary principle we spent some time with, has been cautious about extending his framework to artificial systems. In The Edge of Sentience, his 2024 book, he discusses the boundary cases, the edges where our confidence about consciousness starts to break down, and he includes AI as one of those edges. But he's careful to distinguish between the kind of uncertainty we have about, say, insect consciousness, and the kind of uncertainty we have about machine consciousness. With insects, we have evolutionary continuity, shared neurochemistry, behavioral evidence of nociception and flexible learning. With machines, we have impressive outputs, and impressive outputs, as Searle's Chinese room reminds us, might not be enough. So where does all of this leave us? I think it leaves us in a place of profound and honest uncertainty, which, if you've been listening to this whole conversation, might feel familiar. Because that's been the theme all along, hasn't it? At every stage of this story, from Descartes declaring animals to be machines, to Nagel asking what it's like to be a bat, to Chalmers identifying the hard problem, to researchers painstakingly documenting pain responses in fish and problem-solving in bees, the honest answer has always been, we don't fully know. We're working with incomplete evidence, imperfect frameworks, and a question that may be fundamentally harder than any other question science has ever tried to answer, because it's the one question where the thing you're trying to study, subjective experience, is invisible to every instrument except the one that has it. But here's what I want you to take away from all of this. As you're lying there, maybe drifting, maybe half asleep already, the uncertainty isn't a failure. It's not a sign that science has dropped the ball or that philosophy is useless. The uncertainty is what honest engagement with this question looks like. And within that uncertainty, real progress has been made. We know vastly more about animal minds than we did 50 years ago. We have better frameworks, better experiments, better ways of asking the questions. We have the Cambridge Declaration and the New York Declaration, documents that represent genuine shifts in how the scientific community thinks about consciousness in non-human creatures. We have laws being changed, actual legislation in the UK and the EU and elsewhere, because the evidence for animal sentience has become too strong to ignore. And maybe the most important thing we've learned is humility. The history of consciousness research is, in many ways, a history of expanding the circle of moral consideration, of recognizing that the boundaries we drew were too narrow, that the creatures we dismissed were richer and more complex than we assumed. Every time we've looked carefully, really carefully, with good methods and open minds, we've found more than we expected. More complexity, more flexibility, more evidence of inner lives, the sparrow, the octopus, the bumblebee, the cleaner rasa. Each one turned out to be doing things that nobody predicted, things that force us to take their experience seriously. And so, maybe the right way to end this conversation, or to let it fade, as conversations do late at night, is with that sense of quiet wonder. You're lying in a world that is saturated with experience, not just human experience, but experience in forms we can barely imagine, processed through nervous systems utterly unlike our own, giving rise to perspectives and sensations and ways of being that we may never fully understand, but that are no less real for our inability to access them. The bat navigating by sonar in the dark outside your window, the spider on the ceiling, processing vibrations through its web, the fish in the river, feeling the current against its lateral line. Each one is a center of experience, a small universe of sensation and response, a point of view on the world. And the fact that we can recognize that we can look at a creature so different from ourselves and ask, genuinely and seriously, what is it like to be you? That might be one of the most remarkable things about human consciousness itself. It's the one form of awareness that can wonder about all the others. So let that thought settle in. Let it become part of the quiet around you. And let the wondering carry you gently into sleep.